Okay, let's start then. Hi, everyone. My name's Nick Nesbitt, Princeton University, and want to welcome you all to this discussion and celebration of this new book that we've come out with called Revolutions for the Future, May 68 and the Prague Spring. And on behalf of my co-editors, Jana Ndiaye Berankova and Michal Hauser, and myself, we'd like to welcome our speakers who have also published chapters in the volume, contributed chapters in the volume, and everyone who's joining us today for the discussion. And we will, after a brief introduction, then a number of us will present on aspects of the book and sections and themes of the book, and we'll have time for discussion and questions along the way. And so first of all, I want to thank very much Charles Leonardi and Kelly Eggers at Princeton in the Department of French and Italian, who have helped us at the last minute valiantly make this shift in deference to the strike at Columbia, and made it possible for us to hold the event nonetheless today. And so they've really gone beyond the call of duty, and thanks to them. Also, thanks very much, Charles and Kelly, and also to Jana, who I would say has really driven this project in many ways, and made sure that it's carried forward into this wonderful book that we have now. And it's really a magnificent accomplishment. She's going to talk a bit in a few minutes about the publishing house that she's begun, Édition Suture, and it's I think the third volume. There's also this volume that we put out, a collection of some talks by Alain Badiou, which is also incredibly aesthetically accomplished and a beautiful volume, and this as well. It's really something to behold, and we'll be talking about the contents, but the edition itself is wonderful, and so hats off to you, Jana. Thank you for that. So this project began back in 2017. We had a conference on this theme of the articulation of May 68 and the Prague Spring in 1989 at the French Institute here in Prague. And then, since then, we've brought together some of the original contributions that have been expanded and developed, and as well as others that weren't originally in the conference. And the book itself is divided principally into, let's say, three sections. After a preface, there's a first section on May 68 and the logic of the event, and then a second on Prague Spring and suppressed inventions. And then there's a final postscript that Joe Feinberg penned on 1989 as the end of a sequence. And let me just read, if you will, 2 or 3 paragraphs by which I began my presentation of the contents of the book itself. 1968 is the proper name of a global event that continues to resonate over a half-century later into the present conjuncture, in which a shaken neoliberal consensus confronts anew the specter of revolutionary transformation. 1968 names an event that resounded across continents, a series of interventions taking varied forms from Beijing to Berkeley, Rome, Berlin, Sao Paulo, and Mexico City. It's the contention, then, of this book that the Paris-Prague doublet names, in turn, a particularly potent, reflected site of articulation in this global sequence, one that deserves particular interrogation in the rich complexity of its voicings. So to speak of Prague, 1968 in Prague and Paris as a single event is to assert that in each of these sites, there occurred a restructuration of the norms of social being. To name 1968 an event in Paris and Prague is to confirm that in each of these sites, there occurred a revolution in both structure and experience, in which, as Jacques Rancière affirms in his contribution to the volume, quote, an event, therefore, is not only the unforeseen that happens, but that which calls into question the way in which things happen, the way in which they happen on a particular stage, for example, on the political stage, the way in which they happen in general and in which thinking in general relates to them. At the same time, the relation of these two evental sites, Paris and Prague, is not one of mere identity, but rather the staging of a chiasmatic contrast. In May 68, not only in Paris, but all across France, there occurred a political upheaval that witnessed the single greatest general strike in French history, a monumental coalition and intervention of the intellectual, student, and industrial working classes that brought the routine functioning of this leading Western country to a standstill for an entire month. And in the gap that opened when business as usual ceased its routine functioning, a shocked conservative consensus could only perceive formless chaos, la chien-lit, literally bed-shitting, in the words of de Gaulle's famous rebuke. For those on the street, however, an explosion of creative energy occurred, which was unparalleled in post-war experience, a deployment of sustained anarchic freedom that marked a generation. In Prague, in contrast, the arrival of Warsaw Pact troops in August 1968 marked the brutal termination of the sustained political, aesthetic, and existential experimentation of the Prague Spring and its drive for the autonomous transformation and reform of Stalinist political and social structures. When Soviet tanks compelled Dubček's compliance with the dictates of Moscow, Czechoslovak society suffered a restructuration of its norms of counting, not as the freedom of Badiou's red years of political experimentation, but in the form of the grim and violently enforced consensus, the proper name of which is the baleful euphemism normalization, a social détente that would last until 1989, and the effects of which resonate into the present. So, this then is the book that we're presenting here to you today. And let me just conclude by mentioning my own contribution to the volume in this first section on 68, where I called it the concept of the commodity. And there I looked to Badiou's text from 1968, the concept of model, where he gave two speeches in 1968. The first one was actually presented, and the second one was never given because of the events of May, and then it was only republished much later after 2000. And so there I'm looking at the level of formal theory and looking at the relation between 68 and 89 as a break, the way that Badiou understands that movement in his own thought, from something like an ultra-formalist materialism in the concept of model, a materialism of the concept, to something that we could maybe call an axiomatic materialist logic of the necessary forms of appearance of things in any given world. And then in my contribution, I appended this theoretical disjunction between 1968 and 89 with Marx, Capital in particular, as a sort of palimpsest, and beginning to look at the way in which we can, it would be possible to pursue the original project, the Althuserian project of reading Capital and of Cahiers pour l'analyse in this period leading up to 68, in something like a positive logic of Capital. And in the erasure, the paradoxical erasure of Capital from many of the subsequent developments of these thinkers, and Althusser, Macheret, and Badiou in particular are of interest to me. And so in my chapter then, I was interested in this disjunction between 68 and 89 at the theoretical level, and pointing forward to the ways in which the promise of that original period of 65 to 67, the group Spinoza also, can still remains to be carried forward in the development of something that we could call after Macheret's critique of Hegel in Hegel or Spinoza, 1979, something we could call a positive dialectic, identifying it not just in Spinoza for Macheret, or in a sort of abstract logics of worlds for Badiou, but in the text of Capital itself, breaking away from the negative dialectic, that Hegelian reading that's still predominant today in many readings of Capital. So that's something that I was interested in looking at in my own contribution. And let me just leave it at that for now and pass the word over to Jana.
Thank you so much, Nick. And again, thank you, Kelly and Charles, for hosting us. I think one person we need to acknowledge also is Sarah Monks from the ICLS at Columbia, who made all the possible for this event to happen. And then unfortunately, we needed to shift it to Princeton at the last minute because of the strike. And it's somehow interesting to what extent actually the current context, let's say socio-political, relates also to some of the things which we try to explore in our book. So I would briefly present our publishing project overall, and then I will talk briefly about the contributions in our book, which relate to the, let's say, the context of French philosophy. So let me just show you a few images here. As you see my amazing PowerPoint. Unfortunately, I would prefer for this event to happen in person, but as we can't happen in person, I at least try to show you a few images of what we do, because I think the material context of knowledge, I mean, the books themselves are pretty important. In our publishing house, which we call Édition Suture or Suture Press, and which is a very small non-profit organization run by me, my husband Cher, and 2 other people. We see books as something, I would say, kind of a mnemotechnic tools, because I think there's something, especially about philosophy books, we need to think of the book not only as the medium, but also as the place, as a sort of architecture of knowledge. And so our idea was very much to mobilize, the sort of knowledge of book design and book production that has quite a long tradition in the Czech Republic or former Czechoslovakia, since there were many figures like, Karel Tajge, Ladislav Sutnar, and so on, people who in the interwar period were very much working also on the typography and graphic design, and to try to connect it somehow with the philosophical work that we do. So, we produce books actually very slowly. For now, it's like maybe 1 book per year, but let's hope that it will grow. And so for now, we have published 3 titles and hope to publish another book, another art monograph this year. And then we're working on a project of book on African socialism. And there are other book projects which are in negotiation, especially Reza's book, and which at the moment when the manuscript will be mature, we hope to publish too. And so we run a small e-shop, which I'm giving you the links here. So you can also see all the recordings from the conferences which we organized in Prague with this little informal group that you see here on the screen, which we somehow call very informally Prague Axiomatic Circle. somehow rethinking the original Prague linguistic circle, but playing with the words a little bit in the present. And one aspect that's really important to me, and that's a little bit the title also of the publishing house, Édition Suture or Suture Press. Obviously, it to those of you who are familiar with Lacan or Badiou, you might see the famous notion of the suture. But for us, the play with the words was also to point to the fact that the books that we produce have a clear material presence, and they are actually stitched. So it's a really sort of a, cloth binding and, traditional stitching. So there's this whole procedure of the stitching of knowledge and stitching of philosophy. We somehow played, with this idea. And so this is the book which we're actually presenting today, which, as Nick said, originated in this conference in 2017, but then actually, I would say the content moved pretty far from the original conference. It turned into something much more developed. And it was a conference which we organized in the French Institute and also in the National Gallery in Prague. And that was an occasion to actually invite Jacques Rancière in Prague and to sort of connect our work on, let's say, continental philosophy or French tradition with also the work of the group that Ivan will present here, and that means people who work on the heritage of, Czechoslovak Marxism of the 1960s. And the book has illustrations, so we really, besides the cloth binding, we actually try to really pay attention to, the visual aspects of that volume. And here you can see just a brief sort of presentation of, just to have an idea of not only the content of the book, but the actual form, that in which this knowledge is located. And so, regarding the title of the book that we're presenting today, some people asked me actually why did we call it Revolutions for the Future? Because somehow it doesn't make sense to talk about the Prague Spring and about May '68 as something for the future when we present two past events as being for the future. And I think by this, me and other contributors of the book, I don't want to talk for everyone, but at least for the editing team of Nick and Michal, we wanted to point to the fact that history somehow often unfolds in breaks, leaps, and ruptures. And we were very much interested in the way how, in history, you often have things like the resurrection of names. For instance, in the book, Sometimes We Are Eternal, of Alain Badiou, and Nick points to the fact that sometimes you have these names in history, like, for instance, the word Spartacus, that sort of travel, from one century to another. So you can have the Spartacus revolt in the Roman Republic, but then you also see Toussaint Louverture as so-called Black Spartacus. And there was also the Spartacist League in Germany at the beginning of the 20th century. So by saying that these events are somehow for the future, I think we wanted to point to the fact that, sometimes to answer our present problems, actually, the answers to our present problems can be actually located in the past, or let's say in the forgotten possibilities of the past, like the specters of Marx. These events to some extent haunt us. And so we brought together Prague Spring and May '68, and we called it a chiasmus, to sort of point to the heterogeneity and similarity and heterogeneity of these two events, to point to the fact that somehow these two events seem to present a different role between let's say, the social movement and the state. For instance, comparing the fact that in France, the role of the state and the students' movement is quite different from the Prague Spring, where the movement was actually somehow, launched by the state, but then also exceeded the expectations of the reformist wing of the Communist Party. So it turned actually to something quite different. And I think by bringing these two events together, we also try to combat something that I would call our present amnesia. And we wanted to point to obliterated memories, because somehow these two events, for instance, in France, May 68 is often portrayed through dominant narratives, that describe it as something that's related to, let's say, a hedonism, sexual liberation, the advent of neoliberal consumer culture, and so on. And in what today is called Czech Republic, the Czechoslovak Prague Spring is often reduced to the August invasion of the troops of the Warsaw Pact. And so let's say the creative aspects of this event, like workers' council or all these discussions about workers' autonomy and so on, are often ignored. An example to give you would be the philosopher Karel Kosík, which maybe Ivan will be talking about, a prominent figure of the Prague Spring, who after 68 could not teach at the Charles University during the so-called normalization period. Then he returned to university, after the Velvet Revolution, and he was quickly fired again because in the 1990s, the period which was marked by a wild shock therapy privatization of state enterprises and, let's say, a kind of mafioso transformation of Czech Republic, that I would name as a sort of organized de-development of this country. It was almost impossible to talk about Marx. So someone like Kosík was somehow an uncomfortable figure in both of these regimes. And so our questions that we're trying to ask in this book are, how do these two events compare? And what recipes for the future, or what in French we call l'avenir, actually can these two events propose us, by what recipes can we find by studying the past somehow? And how does philosophy in this case, because some of the contributions of the book are relatively theoretical, so how does philosophy relate to these historical events? And so the book opens by an article by Jacques Rancière, in which Jacques Rancière asks, in what condition can one consider the certain set of facts as an event? And he points to the fact that in many ways, May 68 is often portrayed as an imaginary event. And we have this, ambiguous role of the French Communist Party as a sort of ambiguous intermediary body, which is not always, let's say, in line with the real workers and students and other struggles. And tries to somehow protect the working class from the contagion of the revolt and to collaborate with the government in order to defend the normal game of social relationships, or what Rancière in his vocabulary would call the police logic. And so Rancière talks about this kind of predominant sociological vision of May 68 and this kind of notion of the police logic. And he tries to show that actually maybe May 68 was something quite different, and that he sees May 68 as marked by what he describes as non-sociological politics. And again, I think it's pretty funny that we're here at this moment, when we talk about histories from the May 68 and during the Columbia strike, where also, we have this, our actually students' union, and the so-called United Auto Workers working as a rather controversial intermediary body, maybe comparable in some extent to what happened with the CGT and so on. Then Rancière's paper is followed by a contribution by Vincent Jacques, which is also here, so you can answer to any of your questions, in which Vincent talks about the article published by Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari in 1984, entitled May 68 Did Not Take Place. And Vincent shows us that according to Deleuze and Guattari, May 68 actually did not take place because in a, and I would quote, it somehow belongs to the order of a pure event. So to take place for Guattari and Deleuze would be to belong to a certain historical causality. And Vincent shows in a very subtle manner how actually, Deleuze uses the theory of the Stoics and how this article actually relates to Deleuze's theory of the event, and how, in what extent can 1968 be seen as a sort of new configuration of the possibles, which is related also to new forms of subjectivity, and that in a way for Deleuze and Guattari, the French society may not have been up to the level of the event. So in a way, it was incapable to assimilate the May 68. Then we have a very nice contribution by Étienne Balibar, which I'm not going to talk about in much detail because Étienne will be talking himself after me about Lacan and the four discourses, so-called discourse of the master, discourse of the university, discourse of the historic, and the discourse of the analyst. So I somehow skip and pass my word to Étienne afterwards. Then myself, what I tried to do in my article myself was to actually sort of playing with the name of our publishing house, also was to read the concept of the suture in the work of Jacques-Alain Miller and Alain Badiou, sort of comparing the notion of the suture in Miller's 1965 lecture, Suture, Elements of the Logic of the Signifier, which was then published in '66 in the first issue of the Cahiers pour l'Analyse, with Badiou's response to it in Mark and like on Zero, they think from '69. And so I was trying to show that in a certain way, Miller's approach is marked by, let's say, an attempt to delineate something like a logic of all logics, something that we might call an archaeologics. And, by studying Frege's concept of zero, and that in a way, comparing Miller and Badiou, we can see two different approaches to the structure. On the side of Miller, it might be the idea that we have an excess in the structure and that the structure is somehow complete but inconsistent. Whereas on the Badiou, the approach would be more to see the structure as incomplete but consistent. And so I try to point to these two differences between what I might characterize as a disseminative and subtractive approach on the side of Miller and Badiou. And finally, to give you an idea of what Reza, whom you have here, so you can also ask questions here, Reza Naderi worked on. So Reza wrote a paper on Badiou's '69 concept of the model in relation to Sylvain Lazarus' anthropology of name and his notion of the politics. And so Reza points to the fact that Lazarus presents politics as an engagement without an object that is purely subjective and purely thought. And that for Lazarus, May 68 was an important eventuality that closed one era and opened another one. And so Reza, what he tries to do is to think Lazarus and think Badiou through three categories, which he himself calls interiority, subjectivity, and intellectuality. And he brings forward the categories in relation to Badiou of interiority, novelty, and beginning. And I think he can explain to you, if you ask questions, also what he actually means by those categories. And then obviously Nick's paper, which he himself presented, so I'm not going to go into much detail about that. And I will pass word to Étienne and also encourage all of you, if you're interested in our work, to sort of support our little project and go visit our website and our improvised e-shop and get this monster. Okay,
thank you, Jana. I'll just introduce Étienne. I'm sure everyone watching is familiar with our guest speaker, Étienne Balibar, who is a philosopher and a former student of Althusser. He's a professor emeritus at University of Paris 10 Nanterre, the University of California, Irvine, and among his many publications with which we are familiar, there's Lire le Capital, there's The Philosophy of Marx from 1995, Spinoza and Politics from 98, Politics and the Other Scene, Equal Liberty, 2014, Violence and Civility, 2015, Citizen Subject, 2017, and Secularism and Cosmopolitanism, which was published, I think, in translation in 2018. So it's our great pleasure to welcome you here. Étienne, merci.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nick. Can you hear me all? Yes? Does it work? Good. Thank you. Jana, how much time do you give me? 15 minutes, 20 minutes? Can't hear you. Your mic is muted. You are muted.
Excuse me, 20 minutes is fine. 20
minutes, okay. So I beg you, I ask you, at sharp, 20 minutes sharp, you cut me wherever I have arrived. Huh? Do that, please. Otherwise, you don't get any poema. Okay, let me say how pleased, how delighted I am to be with you tonight, with you all from these different places, old friends and new friends and auditors. I'm extremely proud to be in that book as a participant, as a author of one chapter, but I'm not going to speak about my contribution. First of all, I take a few minutes, if you allow me, to repeat something, but repeat from my point of view, something that has been said and shown, that is how beautiful this book is. I mean, how extraordinary it is. And it's a work of art. I mean, there's no doubt about that. Combining many disciplines or borrowing from them, architecture, design, of course, typography, which is an art, and photography. I'm extremely moved and impressed by the pictures that you have gathered. I mean, they have an intrinsic relationship, of course, to the event of '68. My feeling was that you wanted to avoid not only the well-known, but also the spectacular, in a sense, or the pathetic. But still, of course, the tragedy is there, and also, of course, the hopes and the momentous aspect of this event. I believe that to publish books as works of art is an act of resistance and hope against the current in this moment, in these dark times for culture, for communications in the strong sense, and therefore I value this enormously. And I'm sure others, readers and users will value it. Now, about the content of the book, which is, of course, the main subject of our discussion today, let me begin with something that can seem a little formal. It has been said, I agree with that, of course, that the distinctive character of this book is a combination, has to do with the combination of theory in its most radical or demanding, abstract, in a sense, theory of philosophy on one side and politics on the other one. So they are put together, brought together in a kind of disjunctive synthesis, to borrow the famous Deleuzian category. And as a consequence, of course, they produce, their combination produces remarkable effects of intellectual stimulation. But in fact, the book is not organized around a single dichotomy or duality. It is organized around a double duality, because crossing or perpendicular, if you like, to that distinction and articulation of philosophy and politics, you also have, of course, the Paris versus Prague dichotomy, and the echoes and differences and resonances from one place to another. So the effect, of course, is a structure. It's an extraordinary structure. You could say that this illustrates, as Jana has just proposed, the idea of suture or stitching, but and I agree with that, of course. But the suture is a binary category. It has two edges, and this one has more than two. So it's a more complex structure, for which I would very much like to borrow the fundamental German philosophical category of Zusammenhang. Now, the result, I believe, is something unprecedented, and this could come only for a group from, excuse me, not for, from a group or a community, I would say, of crazy people, crazy others. I'm not, of course, counting myself in that. I'm much too reasonable and academic. And these crazy people who imagined the book and realized it, of course, resurrected the typical and typically philosophical combination of the unzeitgemäßes, the untimely, and therefore, as a consequence, the extremely timely combination of ideas and words. Now, let me say, I'm still in the preliminaries in a sense, and I know that Jana will cut me very shortly now, but let me also say something which I hope is not narcissistic, is a little more personal, about the meaning of that encounter, I would say, that recollection of memories from Paris and Prague in 1968. This is of especially strong resonance and meaning for somebody who, like me, was a young communist in those years, and more generally for a whole generation of French communists. I visited Prague before '68. I'm not going into memories, and I returned much later after '68 with the Jan Hus association that had been founded by Derrida and Jean-Pierre Vernant and others. And in the meantime, of course, Prague was never very far away from our thoughts. I met, in particular, I remember that very dearly several times with Arthur London, with whom I discussed several aspects of the Czech situation. But more generally, as you probably know, there was a kind of direct, almost intimate link between the communists of the two countries. I was, of course, a heretic, I'd say, or a critical communist, but still a communist. The Maoists were obsessed with China. A mythical China, of course, a China which we now know has very little to do with what was actually taking place there during the so-called Cultural Revolution. But many of us were more interested in China, but more interested in Czechoslovakia. And by the same token, I must say that for me, Prague remains the capital of Czechoslovakia. This is something very, at least historically. And because this is, of course, one of the places, and perhaps the main place, where we were looking for the possibility, I would not say of a reform, we're going to return to that. That's a main theme of some of the contributions, especially by Hauser, by Kuzel, by Feinberg. which I read with enormous interest. But I would say a refoundation, a new foundation. Jana just used the category resurrection. That's a very a good term of socialism and communism, which would be linked, of course, directly to a radical critique of state socialism, which at the time we didn't want to call totalitarianism because it was linked to with what we thought was the pure propaganda of the Western imperialism, but Stalinism, if you like. So a radical critique, that is not a counter-revolutionary critique, or that is not a capitalist reversal. And as a consequence, of course, we witnessed and looked at what was taking place there with a succession of hopes, great hopes, great expectations, a famous title says, enormous admiration, and then, of course, sorrow, and even finally despair. And we're still with that question, is there a legacy of all that? And this is what the book is addressing. Now, in 1989, almost everybody would have said no, there is no legacy, no meaningful legacy. Some time ago, perhaps around 2008, when the other hopes of for other people from 1989 started to crumble, at least ideologically or intellectually, we might have begun to say something like perhaps. And this book says a resolute yes. And this is what we, of course, want to discuss, the modality of this alternative. Jana, how much time do I still have?
I leave you 10 more minutes.
10 more minutes, okay. So I have thought, perhaps I don't get to the end, but I have been thinking of 3 items or 3 successive questions under which I wanted to address this issue. The first has to do with the concept of the political. I should be, of course, in a seminar very long on that, and I'll have to be very short. It occurred to me that the question of the concept of the political is really one of the axes and the centers of this book. And of course, one of the themes which organize the echoes and the correspondences between the two sides of the two parts. Now, of course, this issue is addressed, this theme is addressed through a number of important references, especially in French philosophy, but also implicitly in, I'd say, Czech practice. And several names are invoked, Lazarus, Deleuze, etc., and they are all, of course, worth discussion. I limit myself to Jacques Rancière because Jacques Rancière clearly has a privileged position in this book. The book opens with his fundamental essay, and then, of course, it returns several times to his remarkable idea of the opposition between politics and the police, which also becomes sociology in some other context, which works in a sense like a circle. And of course, the description or interpretation of May 68 in France, but also other places, is the criterion for this, the validity of this definition. Now, as we know, of course, the essential question has to do with the use of this very French word part, which is extremely difficult, in fact, to translate. The English in Czech, I don't know, but the English translation, the part of no parts, is not really satisfactory, because la part des sans parts in French simultaneously alludes, of course, to the idea of being part of, a member of a collective or a community, and to being the destinatory or the addressee of a distribution. And as we know, of course, for Rancière, the established order in whichever society, capitalist or really existing socialism, is characterized by a rigid and fixed distribution of parts or roles, whereas the insurrection, typically May 68, represents the moment in which an element which is not counted erupts into the situation and therefore disturbs this distribution. It also seems in Rancière's description that this is an event without a tomorrow, I mean a continuation. It essentially has to do an event limited in time, even if then it continues to resonate, etc. Therefore, as the sexual encounter in some well-known libertine French novel of the 18th century, the good motto would be point de lendemain, nothing after. And no tomorrow, but an infinite possibility of repetition. Now, this seems to have to do, and perhaps I can go further than that, with another fundamental opposition or binary, which returns very powerfully in Michael Hauser's essay, and especially in Joe Feinberg's conclusion, the dilemma of the political and the apolitical. And in a sense, the very strange capacity of exchange or exchanging position between these two characteristics. Now, this leads in the second part of the book to something that I find quite remarkable, which I haven't seen anywhere, which is a kind of use of Rancière against Rancière. Why that? Because Rancière seems to, not only seems, but clearly, I mean, includes in the what he calls the police, as opposed to the political, everything that has to do with negotiating with or even struggling against the power of the state. There must be absolute heterogeneity, and this has to do with the idea that the insurrection is the absolute opposite of the institution. Now, what our friends seem to want to establish in their contributions is a more dialectical articulation of the political and the police. So here, of course, philology would call for very interesting detours. I remind you, if you don't know it, or that la part des sans parts, the part of no parts in Rancière, has of course verbal affinities with le pouvoir des sans pouvoirs, the power of the powerless, which was one of Václav Havel's favorite mottos. And both of them have their roots historically in a great, remarkable text by Maurice Merleau-Ponty about Machiavelli, where this formula, precisely the pouvoir des sans pouvoirs, is being used. Now, what I personally draw as a conclusion from this is the idea that we need a third category. And this third category is, in fact, the category of the impolitical. So the German word das Unpolitische was invented simultaneously in the mid-19th century by Marx on one side in The Poverty of Philosophy and even the Communist Manifesto, where strangely the revolution represented the apolitical side, as opposed to the political state. And by Burckhardt, of course, and who transmitted it to Nietzsche, where das Unpolitische, later used also by Thomas Mann, was the aesthetic or cultural element. I believe that the impolitical is the heterogeneous element. And I think that this book demonstrates that a thought of politics cannot be a thought of the purity of politics. It has to be a thought of the impurity of politics, provided this impurity, of course, is pushed or brought to the extreme. How many minutes now, Jana? 1, 2?
I give you 5.
It is finished. Yes?
It's finished, so you're fine.
Yes, okay, okay. So I stop.
You can talk 5 more minutes if you
Oh,
want.
no. Okay, so I skip. Let me just say one more thing.
No, just let's finish, Etienne.
No, Jana, I don't want any privilege. So I had a next point, which is about the trace of 68. And of course, this is in a sense the very object of the book. And to put it very, very quickly, let me suggest that the key dilemma is whether the trace of 68, which relationship it has to the trace of October, May versus October, 1970. Does 68 as a revolution, or something that calls itself, or is now called by some of us a revolution, reactivate, recover, resurrect, in a sense, the trace and the meaning of October, or does it erase the trace of October and cover it? Perhaps the truth lies in something that Nick a moment ago called a palimpsest, or that Derridian would call perhaps a rewriting of the first in the second. Remarkably, of course, for some of the participants with various intermediary mediations, which are of course extremely important. I referred to the Chinese Cultural Revolution. That was the students in May 68 in Paris, but one always forgets the workers. I'm sorry to remind you that there were workers. For them, the important thing was not the Chinese Cultural Revolution. They absolutely didn't care about it, but it was the Popular Front. And that, of course, is an essential mediation. And the articulation of the question of the Popular Front with the question of the popular democracies, and therefore the Prague coup and so on, is a deep and complex question. So for them, some of when it was a reenactment, for others it was, and particularly some later critics of 68, it was the latter. In fact, the question I believe revolves around several great difficulties which are mentioned in the book. The question of which events have a world meaning. And of course, clearly from this point of view, 68 as a world meaning is a world revolution, provided we take into account all the various events taking place everywhere in the world, profoundly heterogeneous. So this can be compared, of course, to 1917, with the important difference that in 17, the revolution seems to have one center. And 68, I believe, is the destruction of this representation of center. More profoundly, of course, 68 is a reversal, and this is very profoundly explained by Michael, and in particular in a relationship to the question of the state. And of course, this again has to be set on the background of what I would call in Schmittian terms, the nomos of the earth of the time. That is the fact that Paris and Prague are taking place on either sides of the great dividing line, political dividing line between the East and the West at the time, and therefore take inverted attitudes with respect to the question of the state. But the most remarkable in that sense is the fact that they do not take, and this is a strong point of the book, antithetic attitudes with respect to the question of democracy or radical democracy. So in a sense, they both contribute to our attempt at understanding the revolutionary question today as a post-socialist question. The question of post-socialism is the central question for us today. In '89, it was imagined that socialism belonged purely to the past. Now we understand that socialism is one of the antithetic elements in our present. Capitalism is not pure and simply triumphant. And some of us believe that socialism needs to be addressed from a communist point of view. But in any case, of course, it's after the attempt at the transition. Hence the final reflections we could have on the question of revolution. The idea of revolution is central here, and it's also, in my view, the most problematic. Is the idea of revolution an eternal idea? This is, in a sense, what Jana has told us a moment ago, and I understand and admire her point of view, quoting, in fact, from Badiou, who himself quotes from Spinoza, sometimes we are eternal. But you could also quote Rosa Luxemburg, who has more messianic tones. At the moment of the crashing of the Spartacus revolt, ich war, ich bin, ich werde sein. I was, I am, I will be. This is the revolution speaking about herself. And of course, opposed to that, we have the historicist representation, which is best illustrated with the uses, which I do myself sometimes, of the formula we owe to Reinhard Koselleck, vergangene Zukunft. This is a future that was imagined in the past, and therefore it's not a future for the future, it's a future for the past. Now, I do believe that we need a more critical and dialectical reflection on all that, which in particular bases itself on the remarkable multiplication of the meanings of the idea of revolution that has been produced by the 20th century. So we now ask the question that we would never, that no communist would have asked in a century ago, or in the 19th century, whether counter-revolutions are revolutions themselves. And of course, which counter-revolutions are can be considered a revolution. Joe Feinberg uses the remarkable formula, anti-revolutionary revolution. This is part of the problem. But another part of the problem, and here I was very struck by the way in which you quoted from something of Habermas that I had forgotten he had said, but which is remarkable. My admiration for Habermas is growing. Namely, the idea that the question whether there can be a revolution without innovation. And that resonates, of course, with the formula that Zizek and others are eager to quote, which comes from Robespierre. Can you imagine a revolution without a revolution? The issue from there, I argued in several texts, is of course to retrieve the other motto from that period, révolution dans la révolution, a revolution within the revolution, or a revolution in the way of doing, in the mode of doing the revolution or being revolutionary. This is what the 20th century, I believe, has been looking for desperately, in a sense, through various experiences. And here, of course, I can recuperate the Chinese events themselves. And this is, of course, the question that we still have before our eyes in the 21st century, except that, and here I owe something to Rancière that I want to say again, even if his dichotomy seems to be a little mechanistic, namely the idea that you cannot really make a difference between a revolution within the revolution and the idea of democracy, provided democracy is conceived and practiced without limits. And here again, of course, I find it extremely interesting that the descriptions of the reversal or the anti-revolution of 1989 is insisting so strongly on the idea that the first move that in fact blocked the possibility of realizing the dreams and hopes of some of the socialist dissidents was to immediately declare that the democracy can exist only within limits. Democracy without limits. This is, I believe, the motto for one of the mottos for a revolution in the revolution and in the future. Sorry for the length of all that, and thank you for your generosity.
Okay. Thank you so much, Étienne. I think what we would like to do now, so we would accept questions from both the public and the contributors of our book. So I will just encourage you to react. But if I may, I have a question for you, Étienne.
Yes.
Because I found it very interesting the extent to which you actually took our book, which in a certain way is highly political, but at the same time not political in the dogmatic sense, as you said, because it's more the multiplicity of politics within a certain count for one, how you related it to this category of the Das Unpolitische. And I would be curious if you can maybe elaborate on that more. That's my first question. And my second question, which I guess you will find much more tricky and much more direct, is that you are here as, the generation in a certain sense that lived through the May 68. And I was surprised to what extent your talk was actually theoretical, but my question would be much more direct. That means, what were you doing in 68? And you were pointing to the fact that you were a communist at the time. And what did you think about the complicated relationship between the Communist Party and the CGT and the students, which is, there are much talk about how, the Parti Communiste Français in a certain way stopped the revolution, the potential revolution of the students and workers, and prevented the students and workers from uniting. So I would like that you sort of confess here.
Okay, I will do that. Shall I answer immediately, or take other questions before? What's your suggestion? I do what you want.
Just answer, no?
Okay, I think you can go right ahead. We're waiting for more questions.
I try and be brief because I really exaggerated. So Das Unpolitische, this is an absolutely fascinating, I'd say, European philological question. And again, there are problems of translation which are at the same time difficult and very suggestive. The category of the impolitical is used today by people like Roberto Esposito, etc. And I find it, of course, interesting, but I try and have my personal use of it. When you want to translate that into English, you have a problem because the unpolitical is not really common, and the apolitical is, of course, leads you into the wrong direction. The standard reference in our culture is the book that was published by Thomas Mann in 1919 in German, Betrachtungen eines Unpolitischen, consideration of an unpolitical or an apolitical writer. And I will not go to it, and know that Thomas Mann, of course, reversed his positions after that. The genealogy officially traces back to Burckhardt in essays from the 1840s. But what I find most interesting is the fact that Marx, at the same time, is using the same terminology. So, of course, Poverty of Philosophy was written in French, and otherwise Marx would write in German. But what I find interesting, of course, is the fact that when Marx writes at that time, he puts himself not on the side of politics, because he has a narrow, if you want, definition of politics, which associates it with the so-called political state. So the political is the state, and the state is the political state in the Hegelian or bourgeois representation. And of course, he puts himself, that is, he puts the revolution, and he puts the proletariat, and he puts the historic function of the proletariat outside that realm. Hence the necessity, impossible to avoid, to call the position of the proletariat unpolitisch, that is against the political as officially defined. Now you might think that what somebody like Rancière does, and not only Rancière, Lazarus does the same, and Badiou also probably, etc., is just reversing that. That is saying the true political is not on the side of the state, but it's on the side of the communist proletariat revolutionary force, and so on, and so on. And this, of course, shows that there is here an intimate contradiction that revolutions had to do with throughout their story. So I try, yes, to return to that opposition and to suggest that, yes, we have to choose, but what we have to choose is the primacy of one term over the other. The institution or the insurrection, if you prefer. And what is genuinely political, and of course the proletariat in Marx's description was highly political, is not on an isolated side, but is in the heterogeneity and the conflict of both. Reason why, of course, I don't take as political or sufficiently political any self, I would say, consideration of the insurrectional movements, which try and live as if there is no state. The assembly, if you like, in some of its contemporary uses. For the second, I'm sorry, I'm too long, but for the second, where was I? I was in the middle. Reason why, and therefore in a very uncomfortable position. Because essentially the Communist Party, to which I belong, had declared that the students' revolt was a reactionary, etc., movement in the service of the bourgeoisie. So I was absolutely opposed to that. I was no longer a student myself, of course, at the time, and went to different places. My friend Alain Badiou once told me, "You were never where the real important events take place." This was a very nasty formula, which perhaps is right. But if I want to be more precise, I would say that with hindsight, what seems to me important is not to confuse the question of the Communist Party and the question of the CGT, which is what the legend, I would say the post-Maoist legend, leftist legend of May '68 tends to do, with the consequence which is that they see the working class in '68 as they believe the working class to be, and not as it is in practice. So the important phenomenon in '68 is not what is taking place on the side of the Communist Party alone, because the Communist Party doesn't believe or does try to manipulate the events to become governing force, but it is what is taking place within the CGT. And within the CGT, of course, there is a very important conflict between two different wings, which were illustrated later very clearly by the conflict between the leader of the CGT at the time of '68, Georges Segui, a former resistance, and his adversary, what's his first name? Henri Krasuki. So what is important is the fact that '68 launched a movement of transformation within the CGT, which eventually was defeated, of course, and which is well illustrated by Segui and a group of people around him. That took place in the years after. So of course they didn't believe that the situation was revolutionary. In the sense of overcoming capitalism, and perhaps they were wrong, but certainly they believed that the labor movement and the working class movement should become radically transformed. And that is, of course, the side with which I retrospectively with which I have most sympathies.
Okay, any other questions from the contributors of the book who can intervene directly?
Perhaps we can move to other presentations, no?
Maybe Reza, you wanted to ask something, no?
No, I'm good. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Hi.
So maybe there are some questions from the public. So I'll try to. There's actually quite a few of them. So I will try to read them aloud.
Sheena Jane has raised her hand.
Okay.
I see that.
I think we need the questions in the Q&A feature. This one, for instance, Mr. Balibar, in your article about from Jan Czerny, he must be in Czech Republic, asked, Mr. Balibar, in your article about the messianic moment in Marx, yes, you find certain dialectics of political and non-political at work in Marx, yes, which has a theological origin. Yes. In your political theory, you often work with the similar dialectics of political and non-political, right, yet not founded theologically or trying to avoid any theological source of it, if I am right. Does it mean that you do not want to understand the dialectics of the political and non-political as a secularization of any theological thought?
That's a good question and a difficult one. I guess we should separate, we should separate two distinct questions. They're both very important. One of them is the question is the question of the importance of the religious element in politics, and particularly in revolutionary politics. This is an extreme. This is not exactly your question, but I mention it because I believe it can be also raised, and it's a very important one. For a long time now, perhaps I owe that in a sense to my master Althusser, I have become convinced that religious ideas and convictions are extremely important elements of politics, be they present under their official name or under other names. And of course, communism historically is a movement which has extremely strong and powerful religious connotations. You could also say that if you look today at who is speaking a revolutionary language at the world scale, you of course find different people, but Pope Francis is certainly one of them. So that's an important element. The other aspect, which is more central in your question, is the extent to which a theological political model of politics is necessary. Yes, that's what you suggest, in order to analyze the dialectics of the political and the impolitical. So I don't have much time for that. Since the main reference when somebody asks this question is a Schmittian one, and hence perhaps your allusion to the idea of secularizing a theological political model, I would prefer would prefer not to, as either Bartleby or Deleuze would say, which is another way of saying that we must find alternatives for that. So yes to the idea that the religious element in one way or another is always crucial in politics, no to the idea that the dialectics of the political and the unpolitical is pure and simply a realization of theological political models, which amounts in effect to not eliminating, but I'd say critically reversing and bracketing, yes, the messianic element, or more precisely, the eschatological element. The more we live in times of catastrophes, which can be represented as end times, as Zizek particularly wrote. I mean, of course, I admire him in one of his books. The more we need to think of the historical moment and the political forces in terms which are not, in fact, eschatological in that sense. Machiavellian and not Schmittian, if you want.
Okay, may I read maybe another questions? And I would encourage everyone, maybe not just Étienne, but also address it to more broadly to all the book contributors, if you want to just intervene and respond that. There's one question, let me read it. In the book, especially Jacques Rancière was critical to the thesis that 68 in the West led to neoliberalism to some extent. Do you, other contributors, think that this idea is completely false, or is there some truth in it? For example, that the critique of bureaucracy by 68 radicals was maybe more successful than that it should have been. That 68 movements were, after all, more successful in the critique of the so-called old left than in the critique of capitalism. What do the rest of the contributors think about the following question?
So I leave it to others. I've spoken too much. Everybody seems to be frozen.
You're hiding in anonymity.
Did I produce that?
Well, since no one's speaking, I guess I can jump in.
Okay, Joe, thank you.
Well, I mean, I think the easy answer is just to say that, of course, capitalism will react and recuperate. I mean, it's capable. We know how flexible it is, and so whatever happened in '68 would have been, in some aspects, recuperated. But we can also see that capitalism adjusted and had to respond in certain ways to what happened. And of course, the critique of what was in a weaker position would maybe be more successful than the critique of capital itself, which continues to be in a strong position. So critique of the left maybe will always be more successful than a critique of capitalism. Doesn't mean it's less necessary in some sense. But I also think this is an interesting moment to look at the question of the political that Étienne brought our attention to, and I think like a lot of us in the book wrote about, which is that I think in retrospect we can see that maybe this turning there was a certain turning towards the political, even if it wasn't a political kind of political, that happened gradually through various processes in and after May 68. But I think it's a very complex phenomenon that we can't just point to all of the revolts of 68 and say they were turning away from economic questions and not paying attention and only paying attention to politics. It's not as simple as that. But there was a certain shift of taking for granted maybe more of the social or apolitical revolutionary aspects of what Marx was talking about in those early writings, where he says the revolution is apolitical because it is social. There was some sense in which a lot of May 68ers took that for granted, not by speaking against it, but took it for granted and then focused on what seemed to be more immediate, which were problems of culture and politics, which it's very understandable in that context. They were maybe more immediately, they demanded immediate reaction in some ways, but we can see certain long-term response.
Can I know that can I just add a quick thing to that, or did
very quick?
Yes, very quick.
Because we're over time.
Much of the discussion is about, first of all, I argued in the essay on May 68 that I published in Crisis and Critique that you find online in the journal, the special issue of the journal that you'll find easily, that a good evidence of the fact that May 68 was challenging the established order and not strengthening it is provided, of course, by the counter-revolution that took, the neoliberal counter-revolution that took place after. But of course, that does not cancel completely the argument, the perverse argument following which May 68 itself was a kind of anticipation of the neoliberal. And this is something that has to do with the question of individualism. So, and this is not the same individualism. I always argue that on that. The individualism that you seem to find is in 68 is best expressed, of course, in the insistence, the quasi or pseudo-Lacanian, and in fact much more Deleuzian insistence on the question of desire, on the idea of changing life, and not only transforming the society. But this is not an individualism in the neoliberal or bourgeois sense of the term, particularly because it is not the opposite, of course, of solidarity and community. It's a very odd and unstable unity of opposites, but it's not the neoliberal subjectivity. So this interpretation is, which has been proposed by all sorts of commentators, from Régis Debray to Boltanski, etc., is of course interesting, and raises an important problem, but it is not acceptable in my view.
I will maybe read one last question, and then we pass the word to Michal and Ivan, and finally Joe, because we're already running over time. This one question particularly from Alex Taekwangli. He says, thank you for a great talk. My question is about the global effect of May 68. The event was not simply the European Suture, but to some point connected to the Third World movements. Could you please talk about this link? Would maybe other book contributors like to answer this question? Maybe Nick can, no? So shy, everyone. Well, then I answered it. I mean, of course, you know, Alex, that would be a topic of another book, actually, maybe just so many books. I think the 68, especially in the West, is very much, the sort of third world, movement, which is related to the third world and sort of brings into question this whole notion whether what is the first, what is the third world, In a socialist bloc, there's a whole ideology of, what they used to call a socialist, internationalism, which was more like sort of state organized system of exchanges. It's really interesting because there was a so-called University of what they call the 17th November, in which you had actually many like African students and students from the sort of global south going to study to Czechoslovakia, and they get their education for free, and then they were supposed to return. So this was in their country to work as doctors and so on. So that was the, let's say, the state context. For instance, Czechoslovakia itself, I read once, was the biggest sponsor of development in Africa, but not within the, let's say, the humanitarian context that we know now, but it was really sort of like white people working under African bosses. So it was quite special, and I actually have a relatively personal history with that because I found in the archives my grandmother having African students learning Czech, in Czechoslovakia in the 60s. So yes, and also there sometimes you can find some really interesting links. For instance, I remember having worked on some of the archives related to the 68, and in one of the leftist reviews you had especially the German, for instance, the German movement with Rudi Dutschke and so on. There was I found a photograph where German students in 68 were protesting against Leopold Sédar Senghor, whom, as you know, is the big figure of Senegalese independence, but whom they saw as, sort of corrupt capitalist and only playing within the sort of neo-colonial, movement in Senegal. So definitely yes, and I think this is the topic of hopefully many books to come, and maybe we'll do it one day, but for now just to keep it somehow simple, we focused only on the, let's say, the Prague and France, or the Czechoslovakia and France, but there will be much more work to be done on the international 68 movement. And on that, I maybe pass it to Michal, asking him if he can introduce the papers, will introduce the papers relating to Czechoslovakia in the book. And Michal is a philosopher. He's a researcher at the Philosophical Institute of the Czech Academy of Sciences, and he's one of the editors of the book, and also founder of the association called Socialist Circle, and with whom we organized many conferences. So welcome, Michal.
Thank you, Jana and Nick, for your work on this event. I would like to introduce very briefly what I concentrate on in the second part of our book. I would stress that the core or the leading idea of this part was expressed by Étienne Balibar very aptly. And I must say that the leading idea of this section of the book was very simple. If you have a look at the contemporary radical philosophy, from Agamben to some extent to Alain Badiou, you can find that there is a weak point in this field, and it is to question how to conceive the state. We know that all radical philosophy has concentrated on the critique of the state as machinery or as kind of the Bronzierian police order. But I would say that the contemporary radical movements face the question how to regain or regain the state as the assembly of institutions. Can radical politics connected with the state exists? It is the main question according to me, and I tried to use the experience provided by the Prague Spring. I consider the Prague Spring as a great invention in this direction because during the Prague Spring, a special dialectic between the state structure, and the movement from below was launched. And this dialectic is the main invention of the Prague Spring, which can be seen as the heritage provided by the Prague Spring us, and we can learn from the Prague Spring lesson how to proceed in this sense. The specificity or specific trait of the Prague Spring is that the reforms began to turn to revolution. It is a specific kind of revolution which comes from gradual reforms into field of the state structure, which led to the overall social move and following revolutionary movements. And as Petr Kužel pointed in his article on workers' councils in Czechoslovakia during the Prague Spring, this invention had the concrete shape into bodies or into social bodies such as the councils and the companies. But this was not only a social movement, this movement was connected with the law. At that time, the representative of the Prague Spring prepared so-called the law, can translate it to law of the socialist enterprise. And this is a remarkable trait of the Prague Spring, that the results of the movement from below is consolidated at the level of the law system. It is really a remarkable point of the Prague Spring. And one of authors of the book, Jan Kober, showed the development of the law system in the 1960s in Czechoslovakia. This development of the law system reflected the movement in the society. and opened new vision of the legal system. And this is what I call the emancipatory transfiguration of the state. The point is to show the dialectic between the state and the spontaneous movement. And I would like to finish on this point. I don't want to keep you too long, and I skip other contributions because the authors Ivan Landa and Jan Mervart, Katarzyna Bielinska are present here, and they can say something if they like. So I would pass the word back to Jana, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Michal. With Katarzyna or I think Jan maybe left. Would you like to add something about your paper and your focus? And Petra, maybe something about the Workers' Council. Would you like to add something to this? Just to talk about your personal research focus, maybe.
His mic is muted.
Yeah, I think Petra is muted.
Sorry, thank you. I just wanted to show on historical material something about the rancier logic between police, between order of police and order of politics. And it was already said that these two logics are not really heteronymous, but they are very specific dialectics between both. And I wanted to show on the example of fight for workers' councils in 1968 that this emancipatory politics starts with state structures. It was launched by Communist Party and organs of states, but it provokes a spontaneous movement, and these spontaneous movements tried very spontaneously founded workers' councils. It was 900,000 of people who are members of these workers' councils, so it wasn't in any sense something marginal. And this councils was enforced the government and the Communist Party to establish these workers' councils by law, as Michal already said. And after the invasion, the students strikes and workers' strikes wasn't not against the party or against the state, but it was fight for the party and for the state. And it was the fight that gave to people, to parts of no parts, their voice. So that's what I wanted to show on historical examples.
Okay, thank you very much, Petr. I was wondering, maybe Katarzyna, do you have something to say about how these workers' councils relate to, the context of Poland and Yugoslavia?
It's a long story. Thank you very much. It would be a long story, and we are running out of time. So very briefly and very shortly, and sorry for simplification, but I think we all here know more or less the story about workers' councils in Poland in 1956 and we know the story about Yugoslavia. So the general idea was to show, in my case, was to show not quoting Michael, emancipatory transformation of the state, but contrary, seeing real socialism as a system of bureaucratic exploitation of the working class, providing an outlook of Marxist humanism, which of course we know it could be is criticized as not theoretical in Althusserian sense, or in other language, non-philosophical in terms of Marek Siemek, but how it played its role as the ideology of the working class revolting against bureaucratic ruling. Yeah. So and just and this, but it cannot be, so it's it's connected with. It is expressed in the title of the paper, Marxist humanism as the philosophy of self-management or its correlate. So rather, it's ideological correlate, which had its very important has had its very important role, but not philosophy. Of course, not philosophy in the in other terms than Althusser uses, but it's another story.
Okay, and if there are not any other remarks, then I would pass the word to Ivan Landa. So Ivan Landa is a researcher at the Institute of Philosophy of the Czech Academy of Sciences, and they have a department with who some of the other contributors to this book are members of this department, studying more specifically, the Czechoslovak Marxism of the second half of the 20th century, which I would say is a really important work because for a long time this thinking has been very much obliterated. And so I would ask Ivan maybe to present some of the research of the group and whatever you would like to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Jana, for introducing me and for organizing this virtual event with the small letter E. And I won't be talking directly about our department and our research, only indirectly, and also indirectly about the present volume, since originally I was asked about to provide you with very concise roadmap of the Czechoslovak Marxism in connection with the Prague Spring 1968. And of course, this is a huge task to be accomplished in, I don't know if I have 20 minutes or 15. So I will cut brutally the long story short and provide you only with the map with a low resolution. So I hope you will catch at least the contours of Czechoslovak Marxism. If you allow me, I will share with you a PowerPoint presentation. And I will kick off with a small detour or a small observation that relates to Czechoslovak Marxism, as I think. It is usual to speak of Western Marxism, which is broadly construed as including diverse thinkers and currents of thought, such as critical theory, phenomenological Marxism, psychoanalytical Marxism, and even post-Marxism. And there is certainly no doubt in attaching the attribute theory to the Western Marxism. In contrast, East Central European Marxism, and even much more the Soviet Marxism, is usually taken to be either ideology, this used to be a perspective of Sovietology, or as eclectic theoretical endeavor. So it is sometimes believed that it has been theoretically interesting only because of absorbing intellectual impulses from the Western Marxism, from phenomenology, existentialism, and so on. However, such a Orientalist perspective is doubtful and motivates the following question: is it possible to talk about distinctive phenomenon of Eastern Marxism, which would not be reducible in its creative moments to the borrowings from critical theory and so on? My zero claim or zero hypothesis says that there was exactly such an intellectual phenomenon as Eastern Marxism. Famously, British historian Perry Anderson has argued in 1976 in his book Considerations on Western Marxism that there are at least three defining features of Western Marxism. One of them being methodologism. Another one consists in almost exclusive emphasis on superstructural phenomena, especially on arts and artistic practice. And finally, it was a constant pessimism with regards to the perspective of revolutionary politics. So, with a few exceptions, Western Marxists were, according to Anderson, evolutionists who occupied their ivory towers at the university campuses without any contact with the real politics or with social and economic struggles of the working class. I assume that Eastern Marxism can be defined analogically through methodological turn, which had in fact two different outcomes, as I will show in a minute. For now, it suffices to say that methodological turn resulted into rethinking of the dialectical method and at the attempts to carry out the reconstruction of historical materialism. The reconstruction went in two different directions. Some of them stressed the importance of superstructural phenomena, such as culture, law, religion, and especially politics. Besides that, Eastern Marxism, at least during 1960s, can be characterized by sheer revolutionary optimism that can be described as longing for total revolution, to quote the book title by Bernard Jack. Of course, Eastern Marxists understood themselves as engaged intellectuals whose main political goal was to contribute both theoretically and practically to the success of socialist revolution, which would not be limited only to the building up of democratic institutions or to securing basic political freedoms. In their perspective, revolution required the self-management of workers, the securing of social and economic rights, and all this was coupled with the hope in a radical technological progress bound to automation. The majority of them were party intellectuals, hence they also occupied, in some sense, the ivory towers at universities, academic and party institutions. However, many of them were actively engaged in the real politics, especially during the Prague Spring 1968. As I've mentioned above, Eastern Marxism can be characterized by methodological turn that took place in 1950s almost simultaneously, yet initially independently at different places. In Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Yugoslavia, as well as in Soviet Union. So there had to be something in the air at that time. Still, I don't think the methodological turn can be explained only by the reference to the political events, for example, to the death of Stalin or to the critique of the cult of personality or Stalinism as such. There were much deeper systematic reasons at play inherent to the Marxist philosophy. First of all, it was partly due to the renaissance of the Leninism and partly due to the coming back to the philosophical debates in Marxism in early 1920s. So accordingly, the methodological turn had at least two important sources, one of them being Lenin and his philosophical notebooks, and the second one, György Lukács' History and the Class Consciousness. And I think that each of them motivated quite different course of the methodological turn. Lenin famously stressed the importance of Hegel's science of logic for understanding of Marx's Capital. At the same time, he claimed that although Marx did not write any logic of his own, there is still something like the logic of his Capital. In Lenin's view, Marxism should hold on Marx's theorems of value, exploitation, of crisis, and so on. But besides that, it is equally and perhaps even much more important to understand the methodology employed by Marx in his theorizing of the social reality. Hence, Marxists should pursue the project that would aim at extracting the logic or methodology employed by Marx, laying it bare independently of Marx's conceptual apparatus. In this case, methodological turn consisted in the retreat from the concreteness, from social reality, from the real people, and ongoing social struggles. Instead, the attention has been paid to the dialectics understood as a methodology, and further to the way how to build scientific theories, what are the basic categories employed within the scientific discourse, and especially to the problem of explanation of social phenomena and to the formulation of social laws. So I shall call this specific form of Marxist theory meta-Marxism. And just to give you some examples, I quote some books titles from Czech and Slovak provenience. So you can see it's on the logic of Marx Capital, the contribution made by Marx Capital to the knowledge of social laws, or the problems of semantics, the method of science, the dialectical scientific law, or methodology and philosophy. Interestingly, during the 1960s, the meta-Marxism has been transformed into epistemology, general semantics, logic proper, philosophy of science, cybernetics, system theory, and later into sociological methodology. Typically, all the explicit references to Marx, Lenin, or Marxism disappeared altogether during those years. At the same time, the methodological turn took a wholly different shape. It has been inspired by György Lukács, who proposed a methodological understanding of Marxism already in 1920s. In brief, he claimed that Marxism is not a doctrine, it's not a propositional content, but consists only in dialectical method. Therefore, it is possible to imagine that all theorems formulated by Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, or Trotsky can be falsified and dismissed. But still, it will be possible for somebody to proclaim himself or herself to be a Marxist because of the dialectical method. So here, in contrast to meta-Marxism, the dialectical method is understood differently. It is not only a method of thought or of theory, but it is supposed to operate directly within the social reality as far as the self-conscious beings are integral part of social reality. In this case, the methodological turn aimed at concreteness, at social reality, and especially on real human beings living, thinking, and acting here and now. In traditional version of historical materialism, the real human beings were rather neglected, and the attention was paid to macrostructures, social laws, technological progress, without any serious focus on human beings as subjects that produce and reproduce social form, that engage in social struggles, that motivate and intervene into technological progress, and so on. So I call this kind of methodologically motivated Marxism philosophy of praxis. And again, I give you just a few book titles that were like important contributions to the philosophy of praxis in 1950s and 1960s. So it's, for example, the modern spiritual reality and Marxism, dialectics of the concrete, individual and society, civilization at the crossroad, etc. The philosophy of praxis had a wide range, as you can assume, of themes to cover. It focused on labor, revolution, and more specifically on the problem of scientific technological revolution, on automation, as well as on modern technology, on everydayness and alienation, on human nature, and farther on culture as a structure of meanings, and on the problem of realism in arts, and also on the problem of use value in relation to industrial design. However, the central issue remained to be following: how social reality and the structures of meaning are produced and reproduced through human activity, and how it can be radically, social reality transformed through revolutionary practice. So in contrast to meta-Marxism, which refrained from any judgments concerning politics, economics, culture, or human beings, philosophy of praxis was politically engaged through and through. As a matter of fact, philosophy of praxis has provided the theoretical underpinnings of the political events bound to the Prague Spring 1968. I don't know if we have enough time, but I should only mention three most significant philosophies of praxis. And I think each of them gives evidence for the assumption that during 1960s, the central issue in Eastern Marxism has been the problem of human nature and human essence. So like issues that fall under the umbrella of philosophical anthropology. So Kosik, in his dialectics of the concrete, he tried to elaborate philosophy of praxis in the direction of social ontology. And this ontology is grounded conceptually in the theory of or ontology of labor, which he understood as ontocreativity, so as an ability to bring about new qualities and even new realities. Kalivoda, in his own contribution, elaborated the version of psychoanalytical materialism in which he attempted to naturalize this ontocreativity and ground it in the conception of human nature. And finally, Radovan Richta proposed a theory that should be somehow, the reconstruction of historical materialism, so that it would be able to conceptualize not only industrial societies, but also the step towards post-industrial societies. And he proposed a theory of the forces of production, which is grounded in the theory or the notion of human creativity, which he strives to reconcile with the ideal of automation. And this means also with the technological determinism. And I will skip some details, and I will just mention that not only the examples of Kosik, Kalivoda, or Richta, there were definitely many other thinkers. They show that the discussions on political reforms, social revolution, and on automation that were topical during the Prague Spring in 1968, that were based on philosophical debates that concerned human nature and human essence. So I will stop here and thank you for the attention.
Thank you so much, Ivan. I think this is a really tip of the iceberg, right? I would like to ask maybe the contributors of the book if you have any questions for Ivan regarding what you just presented about Czechoslovak thinking and Marxism and so on.
I had a question for Ivan. I was wondering, Ivan, we've talked about Radovan Richta, and you didn't say too much about him, but I find fascinating the contradictions that he gets himself into in a very interesting intellectual project that he has, and I wonder if you could say, I mean, people are maybe more familiar with Kosik and some of the other figures you talked about, but I think Richta is really interesting in a lot of ways that you've been working on, and I wonder if you could say a little bit more about your understanding of his contributions and their limitations.
All right, so I will try to do it in brief. Well, basically, and I think that was also the theme of our talk about Radovan Richta, was that not only him, but also other philosophers of praxis, they relied and tried to somehow synthesize the young Marx that had a theory of total humanity, of human being that can develop all his capacities and skills and powers and so on under certain circumstances, with the idea that Marx voiced, especially in Grundrisse, where he was thinking about the labor and this distinction he drew in early manuscripts between the necessary and labor and free labor. Yeah. Later on, he has he made a distinction between labor, which just covered necessary labor, which means like instrumental activity, directed to central goal, some goal. And on the other side, the free activity, which he did not call labor, but precisely, the creative activity. And his idea was that since the progress, technological progress, will bring sooner or later the complete automation of the production, so it means the level of this necessary labor, yeah, the space will be opened for human beings to cultivate themselves, to be engaged in free activities and so on. So his humanism presupposed the certain theory of the technological progress, and much of the hope he put into automation. And of course, at the same time, the debates on automation were not limited only to this Eastern Marxism, but were quite vivid also in, I suppose, also in France, in USA, and so on. And I think in the late 50s or at the beginning of the 60s, Hannah Arendt wrote a paper called Human Condition. The paper had the same title as a book she later wrote, where she challenges this view that the automation will, unbound free activity of human beings, as she supposed or assumed that automation will make production more efficient. Yeah? In the sense, there will be like more products for more people with low, energy costs and so on. But on the other side, since the products will be available easily for many people, the people won't be gaining the free time, engaged in developing their activities and capacities, but they will just consume. Yeah? So automation and consume society are just, the twins in her conception. So, but as I think, Richta and his colleagues, they were more optimistic, and they thought assumed it's possible to square the circle, you know, to square humanism, total humanism, with the like total technological determinism. In this sense, I find the Richter's theory and of course the theory of many other thinkers who were part of, or the members of Richter's team, who you know, developed very interesting ideas that would fall today under the umbrella of, you know, transhumanism, as they you know, focused on the idea that, you know, we have this forces of production, means of production, and human labor force, yeah, which was reinterpreted, as I have mentioned, as a productive force. Yeah, it was like productivity unbound, and they said precisely this human productive, creative force allows for extensive and intensive growth, not only means of production where you have more sophisticated machines and automata. Yeah, and as I've mentioned, Kalivoda, who developed the theory of human nature, which is like this biological infrastructure that for him cannot be separated from this, you know, human essence, which is for him this social nature of, or the second nature of the human beings. So he thought, you know, there is certain continuity between those two natures, this biological and the social, and the biological always encroaches into this social realm. So he thought this biological infrastructure is something, you know, stable, constant. He calls it anthropological constant. Yeah. And the adherents of scientific technological revolution, for example, Otto Klein, he thought, you know, perhaps also this biological nature sometimes will allow for some, you know, changes and variability. So he thought there is nothing constant in reality within this, you know, human nature. So in this sense, we should not like conceptually distinguish between nature and essence. Yeah. So I think that the conception of scientific technological revolution opened up so many themes and topics that I think still are topical at our days, especially as the you know, ideal of automation touches our everyday life, and yes, and is part of not only of, you know, the sphere of production, but of our life world.
Thank you so much, Ivan. And Nick, I have maybe a question to sort of make work this chiasmus, you know, which is at France and Czechoslovakia. I was wondering, maybe for Étienne Balibar, to ask you whether you know if there and also this point, and this relates to one question that someone in the Q&A was asking, whether, Ivan, you know what were the sort of international connections of these thinkers that you presented, like Karel Kosik, Kalivoda, and Richter. And I would be curious whether, Étienne, also whether, like, to what extent you know that their work was known or, you know, present in the French circles, if you have any experience with that. So it's a question for both Étienne and Ivan.
I will be very brief. First of all, I'd have to return to the publications of the time, but I think that very few of these works were translated, at least into French. And personally, I remember reading some of it in German because this was the only possibility I had to access them. But then I have to confess that the kind of structuralist Marxism in which I was raised at the time produced an extraordinary blindness, I would say, to the kind of questions that where you have just dealt with, etc. So there's no point in being apologetic or etc. This is one aspect of the divide. We had a tendency, and I'll finish with that, in our circle. And I think it would be interesting to hear Reza, because I think that Deleuze and Guattari later, of course, were very differently oriented, but I'm not sure if they also paid great attention to that. We had a tendency to put everything that labeled itself philosophy of praxis in the same basket, I would say. Which listening to you clearly is a great confusion. Just as we, I would say, the Althuserian circle, because in fact of Althusser's apparent hostility, were very much against the idea that the Lukácsian legacy was something important. Needless to say, I totally changed my point of view today, and I am reading Lukács very eagerly, not only because I believe that the transformation of the idea of consciousness into the idea of praxis is something extremely important, even or if or because it has Hegelian origins, but also because I believe that the category of the identical subject-object, or that we have, perhaps we can also reverse or transform into a problem of the non-identical subject-object, is a question of enormous relevance in today's politics. Now, because I have to end, I'd say that, and tell me if I'm wrong, my feeling, at the time, for example, what I read from Czechoslovakian philosophers was particularly essays and articles on the question of cybernetics, and therefore also technology. And I think that they were much more advanced, in fact, than many philosophers in the West on that question. I praised Habermas a moment ago, but when Habermas writes about technique as ideology, clearly technology is on one side and humanism is on the other side. Whereas the articulation that you describe, especially when it comes to suggesting that the so-called essence of man or biological invariant of man is something that becomes transformed both by technology and society, is something which is extremely different from that Frankfurt School variety of philosophy of praxis, and therefore, of course, enormously interesting. But this is something that I perceive retrospectively, and when I look back to those years, I see that we lived in two different worlds. Not everybody. If you take somebody like André Gortz, of course, he has a very different perception. But the Althusserians had a terrible tendency to put everything under the label of humanist Marxism, which prevented from discussing and seeing the differences, And Althusser had explained that humanism and philosophical anthropology were two names for the same thing. Foucault, in the order of things, began to open up the question, and today I'm completely convinced that the question of philosophical anthropology is a central one, which doesn't make me necessarily nostalgic of certain forms of humanism, but that's a long discussion we could have.
Ivan, would you like to maybe react to that? Or is there anyone else from the contributors? I think, Étienne, you were making allusion to Vincent's research on Deleuze and Guattari. Vincent, is there anything you would like to add, about any links between Deleuze and Guattari and these thinkers?
I don't know, but I think they don't read this tradition. So maybe Guattari reads it, but Deleuze references are quite of, about Western philosophy, no? So I don't know. Maybe at the time of the Untitled, there's a lot of strange reference for a French philosopher, but I don't think I see Czech references. But it's a good question.
And I think Joe Grim-Feinberg writes me that he has a comment to make.
Yeah, I mean, just following up on Ivan's presentation, I from the other side of the picture, it is very interesting how, in spite of this difference between what the Althusserian tradition and the Czechoslovak reform Marxists were writing about and thinking about, there were a lot of points in which they could have had interesting discussions that generally didn't happen back then. I mean, not only the question of humanism, which it is remarkable that the Czech Slovak humanists didn't react directly to these Althusserian criticisms and then post-structuralist criticisms of humanism at the time, but also it's interesting that there is a Czech structuralist tradition, and so Czech and Slovak humanism comes also back with a kind of revival of interest in structuralism in this specific Prague structuralist linguistic circle tradition. And so then the next moment, there is this kind of post-structuralism that happens in a certain sense in Czechoslovakia, but it's a completely different post-structuralism and different discussion about humanism and anti-humanism. And it's kind of a shame that discussion didn't happen actively at the time, but it is interesting that we can then make this discussion happen in some sense today.
Any other comments, reactions? This may be one question from the public. Stephen Mayu is asking Ivan Landa. So he says, Ivan, you mentioned in passing, I quote, philosophical anthropology. Was the philosophy of praxis you've outlined related by its 1960s proponents to critiques of philosophical anthropology in France in the 1960s? For example, Derrida's article, The Ends of Man, a paper actually given in the US in October 1968.
Well, I have to admit I don't know much about this this link. If there has been any influence of that paper written by or this speech, this talk delivered by Derrida in like these Eastern quarters, but definitely, as I was listening to this. Connections between French and Czechoslovak or Eastern discussions, I would definitely mention, the phenomenological Marxists in France. There, I think, has been much closer, discussion occurring at that time. So definitely, Kosik read Tran Duc Thao, this Vietnamese Marxist philosopher, and there were other philosophers, I think, in France who somehow, received with enthusiasm the dialectics of the concrete as it appeared in German translation, in the late 1960s. So I'm not sure about, for example, Michel Henry, if he could have known Kosik and other philosophers coming from Czechoslovakia. But perhaps I should also mention Kalivoda, because his essay on Marx and Freud has been translated into French language in the late 1960s. But again, I don't know much about any reception among French intellectuals. Yeah, so definitely the situation have changed during 1970s or after 1968, when there was this, wave of emigration and exile, and a lot of Marxist philosophers came to France, to Paris, and that could be, occasion for some contact. And of course, at that time, Marxism has been in the crisis, which paradoxically, expressed or voiced itself in that many Marxists started to write the history of Marxism, and started to retell the whole big story of making up of Marxist theory in its variety. And of course, there were many Marxists who were very critical towards Marxism, like Leszek Kolakowski, if you read his book on the history of the Marxism. But there were many others, Hobsbawm, several volumes of the history of Marxism, where I think a couple of Czech authors made contribution. For example, Lubomír Sochor, Miloš Hayek, the historian, and others. And at that time, in the late 1970s, those thinkers, Sochor, for example, came in the late 70s to France, when Marxism was not, very popular. So he had, in this sense, difficulties to establish, the Marxism and the history of Marxism as a research theme at the university or at the department where he worked. But it's another story. It's a post 1968 story, and yeah, that would be my answer or non-answer to this question about Derrida.
I always forget the micro. Maybe to conclude, I'd like to pass the word to Joe, who will present us another monster, which I don't know, Joe, is this the last volume of Kontradikce, which is an English Marxist journal, half in English, half in Czech. So if you can maybe just present that.
Yeah, thanks, Jana. I'll be brief because I know we're over time, but we have had the pleasure of having this opportunity to have Jana be kind of a node of conversation between some of the work that we're doing in Prague, a lot of it surrounding the Department for the Study of Modern Czech Philosophy, of which Ivan is the department chair. And yeah, we put out this journal, Contradictions, or Contradictions in English, Kontradikce in Czech, once a year, large volume. And we have a lot of precisely the kind of things we've been discussing today is very much what we are interested in, looking back at the history of radical left thought in Central and Eastern Europe, but in conversation with things that are theoretical discussions taking place around the world. And so, yeah, Jana held up the second to last volume, which is on the critique of civil society, which was, of course, a major concept of dissidence and of the interpretation of what dissent meant in the liberal understanding. And we just published a volume on left feminism. And so that you can order it or find some online content. Thanks, Jana, for posting the website. You can find also all the back issues. So all these three, you can already find the articles posted on the website. And the left feminism issue is now available as well. And we're also working on a new volume on left dissent that should come out around the end of 2021. So I hope you all read and think about contributing to the future, and look forward to more collaboration with Suture down the road. And thanks again for organizing the book and the event.
And Joe, people can order it through your website, which I posted it, right? Is that right?
Yeah, there's a link to order the books, and yeah. And yes, again, the physical copy is nice to have. You can build a house with it or read it.
Okay, any concluding remark for today? Nick, maybe would you like to conclude, or anything to add?
Well, I think it's as Etienne said, this volume is really a wonderful accomplishment. I'm happy to be a small part of it, and I think that it really marks. I was struck listening to Ivan and the richness of this political and philosophical tradition in Central and Eastern Europe in the 60s, and particularly this divide that we've been talking about and that Ivan was gesturing toward. I think that, and Joe as well, I think that it's the book itself is a really interesting, a really important contribution, I think, toward bridging that gap, that historical gap that Etienne was talking about, that has so many complex dimensions and implications and ramifications over the development of these political sequences in the West and in the East, and in their complex silences and gaps and interferences, misunderstandings, influences, all of this. I mean, there's so many different paths that remain to be followed and developed. And I think that it's one of the really striking accomplishments of the volume, and the contributors, everyone here and others who couldn't be with us today, who've marked out such important and complex and complexly argued and rendered presentations of many of the elements of this East-West gap and divergent conversation and influences, and so I think the book marks a real step in overcoming that gap and that historical disjuncture, and so I hope that the discussion today will lead others to take a look at some of these really interesting chapters that people have contributed, and that it will mark an important step in some small way in terms of enriching and complexifying that ongoing political and theoretical discussion that we've figured between Paris and Prague, between 68, 89, and the present, and the present imperatives and problems confronting us in late capitalism in 2021.
Okay, thank you so much, Nick. Thanks to everyone for attending. Thanks to our contributors for making this book possible, and for being involved in those debates. Again, if you want to stay in touch, just have a look at our website or write us an email. You can check the Facebook, you can check order the book at our improvised e-shop where my colleague Monica is handling all the orders. And so just feel free to stay in touch with us through other means. And thanks to everyone for this little webinar. And I hope it will be soon in person and it will be more fun to have our conferences in person, whether in Prague or in New York or in Paris or whatever that can be, in Africa maybe.
Yeah, and thank you, Jana, for all the work that you've done to make this happen.
Thank you, Jana.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Thanks, Jana. Thanks, everyone.